Hey everyone, this is a piece titled Aspects of the Labor Government by Max Shachtman. It's from a chapter within the book Neither Capitalism Nor Socialism, edited Theories of Bureaucratic Collectivism, edited by Haberkern and Lippau. I'm gonna read first the this piece is in a broader section of the book, chapter 5, titled Beyond the Third Camp. And I'm going to read the little introduction to this chapter in addition to the article. In the first article selected here, the author begins his discussion of the significance of the post-World War II British Labour government by briefly summarizing the Marxist position on the possibility of a, quote, parliamentary road to socialism, end quote, that is, on a constitutional, peaceful transition to socialism as opposed to an insurrectionary one. The question was raised in the public mind by the serious and unexpected anti-capitalist measures taken by a legally elected government. After stating his position that a socialist transformation requires the independent self-mobilization of the working class, which, under certain circumstances, may confront the ruling class with the choice, either allow a popularly elected government to carry out the anti-capitalist measures demanded by its working class base, or resort to illegal insurrectionary methods, the author argues that this is not what happened in Britain. Instead, the Labour government made serious inroads on capitalist power while restraining independent working class activity. It was this that raised the, quote, new question. Is there a third possibility, a non-working class, bureaucratic, quote, road to socialism? In the event, this speculation by observers at all points of the political spectrum proved premature. The revival of capitalism in Western Europe, stimulated by the Marshall Plan and the Korean War boom, led to a corresponding revival of traditional, more or less, reformism. The anti-capitalist trend in Britain and Europe reversed itself, at least temporarily, and the measures taken by the Labour government in the end came to little more than a large-scale and expensive socialization of the losses of the capitalist class. Unprofitable but vital industries such as coal were nationalized, subsidized by taxes levied on the lower classes in particular, and the investors pensioned off adequately even while they screamed about socialist tyranny. Once more, a socialist government carried out a necessary but painful reform of the capitalist system, which no openly pro-capitalist party could summon up the courage to carry out. Nevertheless, the extent of the measures taken against particular sections of the capitalist class and the extent of nationalization required to stabilize post-war capitalism on the continent and even in the United States as well as in Britain represented a qualitative change in capitalism. If the anti-capitalist measures taken by the Labour government did not lead to a new post-capitalist society, they still raise the question, how far can such, quote, despotic inroads, end quote, go before we can say, quote, this is not capitalism anymore, end quote. The next two articles by Hal Draper continue this discussion of the myriad and influential political tendencies towards this, quote, bureaucratization of capitalism, end quote. I don't know why, but it says capital-ism in the post-World War II period. The significant point here is that these political and ideological tendencies were typically found on the right wing of the socialist movement and even among non- or anti-socialists. The final section by Seymour Melman is a selection not only from a substantial book, but of a substantial body of material. The discussion was initiated, as far as we have been able to tell, by a 1944 article published in the magazine Politics, edited by Dwight MacDonald. The author was listed as Walter J. Oakes. This was the pseudonym of an economist employed by a Wall Street firm. The argument briefly summarized was that capitalism could only avoid a repeat of the Great Depression by heavy government subsidies. In the political context of the day, that was only possible through military expenditures which, whatever their justification militarily, provided the kind of, quote, pump priming, end quote, that Roosevelt's New Deal had never been able to provide. This thesis was elaborated on by the same author using a different pseudonym, T.N. Vance, in the New International in the 1950s. We have chosen to excerpt the Melman chapter because, being written 20 years later, it has the advantage of being able to present in historical perspective a tendency which Oakes/Vance was analyzing on the fly. It would take us beyond the limit set for this collection of historical articles, to comment on more recent developments such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. These agencies, run by unelected and, with the exception of the occasional Paul Wolfowitz, unknown bureaucrats, are instruments of bureaucratic planning, which make a Stalinist Gosplan functionary of the 1930s look like a small businessman. Aspects of the Labor Government by Max Shachtman. As with the long post-war, Sorry, fucking up. God. Alright, where am I? I need my headphones. Aspects of the Labor Government, Max Shachtman. As the long war post-war boom winds down with the consequent reemergence of chronic mass unemployment and stagflation, the growth of bureaucratic collectivist tendencies at the expense of classical reformist socialism is likely to continue. The, quote, new question posed by the experience of the labor government is not, then, whether socialism can be established by parliamentary means or only by extra-parliamentary means. It is this. Can the working class reach socialism only by the working class's own efforts, by the working class's direct class rule over the economic and political life of the country, or can socialism be attained without workers' control and simply by an expropriation of the bourgeoisie, carried out one way or another under the control and direction of a more or less benevolent workers' bureaucracy? The spread of Stalinism has raised the same question in one way, the labor-rate government in another way. If it is not the most vital question of our time, it is certainly one of the most vital. Not a few Marxists have abandoned the basic convictions of the founders and teachers of scientific socialism by replying, in effect, in the affirmative, yes, the road to socialism lies or may lie through the domination of society by a workers' bureaucracy or a bureaucracy that arose out of the labor movement. They have concluded that the Stalinist revolution is the socialist revolution, the Stalinist society is progressive, that the Titoist state is socialist, and the like. As for ourselves, we remain unreconstructed in our belief that the emancipation of the working class, that is, socialism, is the task of the working class itself and no one else. The experience of the labor government, especially when considered as it must be in the light of the social and historical significance of the rise of Stalinism, has not modified our belief in the slightest degree. We see no grounds in the realities of British society to warrant such a modification. That the general position of the British working class is improved under the Labour government is undeniable. That the general position of the British bourgeoisie is deteriorated is equally undeniable. But what has been most significantly strengthened and improved is the economic and political position of the Labour officialdom. It is the Labour officialdom, first and foremost, to have benefited from the economic and political changes effected by the Labour government, just as it is they and not the working class itself that have effected the changes. This implies that classical reformism itself has changed. That is correct. It corresponds to the profound changes that capitalism has undergone. Classical reformism is exemplified by the old German social democracy and the Labour Party of the MacDonald days. Not think of expropriating the bourgeoisie and actually abolishing the rule of capital in the economy, or if it did think of it, it never went further than to translate its thoughts into hollow public speeches and writings. The German social democracy, when it had complete control of the country, published its findings in weighty scientific tomes under the direction of Karl Kautsky himself, but it never nationalized the coal industry. If the MacDonald governments even talked about nationalization, the tones were too faint to be remembered today. The contrast with the present Labor government is clearly evident. The classical social democracy was a bureaucratically dominated product of the rise of capitalist imperialism. Its ideology and social interests were shaped in the period of that rise. It drew its economic sustenance from the vast super profits accumulated by the big imperialist states. It acquired a stake, modest but nonetheless a stake, in the preservation of capitalism, that is, of private property in the last analysis. It opposed the extreme bourgeois reaction which would wipe out the labor movement that was the mass basis for its privileged economic and social position. It opposed the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism which would bring the working class to power and abolish, in a socialist way, the special bureaucratic privileges it enjoyed. Hence its basic attachment to capitalism, to capitalist prosperity, to capitalist democracy, to capitalist colonial policy, to reforms which would solidify its mass base and add to its own privileges. A very excellent example of this reformism in the life and in the flesh and in a specific national form, of course, is to be found right here in the United States, the American labor officialdom. Its like exists nowhere else on earth today because there is no longer any capitalist power comparable to the American. The other capitalist regimes have collapsed or always on the brink of collapse, economic and political, the British included. The empire of old is at an end. At an end, too, are the huge super profits which corrupted the British working class, primarily the British working class's officialdom for generations. Britain is, for example, in debt to India today! In one country after another, again Britain included, private property is less and less the basis for national economic strength and prosperity, and this becomes more and more obvious even to the labor aristocracy. Ideology lags notoriously behind social reality. In France, where capitalist decay is further advanced than in England, the ideology of the reformist officialdom, or what is left of it, has not changed significantly. It acts and thinks as if it still had the old stake in the preservation of private property. In England, however, the ideology of the labor officialdom is kept much more active pace with the changes in the historical position of British capitalism. Compare British capitalism of 1945 with British capitalism of 1924, and you get a fairly adequate measure of the change in the Labour Party, and for that matter in the working class as a whole, from the days of MacDonald's rule to those of Attlee and Bevan. It's not, of course, a question of the personal sincerity and integrity of this or that official, which we would like to believe is of the highest quality. It is a question of social forces and interests and ideologies. The official slogan of, quote, socialism now means in practice, quote, socialism for the officialdom, or, quote, socialism directed by the officialdom in the very best interest of labor, end quote. This means no socialism at all, but it does mean a different attitude toward private property and capitalist rule of the economy. Yesterday's reformist officialdom, the labor bureaucracy of today, wants to dispossess the present property owners, wants to take over industry, wants economic and political control of the country, even if its training dictates Fabian prudence and gradualism in achieving its wants. It may think it wants it for the working class. It doubtlessly does think so, but Marx in his time and Freud in his taught us not to judge a man by what he thinks of himself, a man or a social group, but by what he does and by the objective effects of his actions. The present officialdom wants to dispossess the old property owners, not in order to install the free rule of the working class. Socialist democracy, genuine proletarian democracy, would give the bureaucrats, we speak not of this or that individual, but of a specific social stratum, even less in the form of special position, privilege, and power than it enjoyed in the heyday of capitalism. That is why in Britain today, unlike Russia in 1917, the undermining of the power of the capitalist is not accompanied by an extension of democratic socialist workers' power. An adequate treatment of the foreign policy of the Labor government is of key importance, bracket, as in the related question of the specifically Laborite, quote, theory, unformulated and unvoiced but nonetheless real, of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, which pervades the thinking and action of the British government, end bracket. But it must await another occasion. Here it must suffice to point out that the very nature of the change in British reformism determines the fact that British reformism's foreign policy is essentially imperialistic. It is no more the task of the labor officialdom to liberate the colonial peoples than to emancipate its own working class. Its task and concern are to reorganize Britain and as much of the empire as its broken forces enable it to hold together in its own interest. It is true that the Laborites agreed to grant India national independence, but that was imposed upon the Laborites by the Indians. In Malaya, Laborite foreign policy shows itself to be as outrageously imperialistic, rotten, and barbarous as the French in Indochina. It may be freely granted that the Labor government's foreign policy is, on the whole, much more democratic than Stalinist Russia's, but it is not one whit less imperialistic in its fundamental character. The new rulers and would-be rulers have little interest in preserving the power of the British capitalist class, but they have shown active interest in preserving whatever colonial policy they could in the interest of Britain, that is, the British government, that is, themselves. 5 years of the new Labor government have brought the country and its working class to a fork in the road. If the present basic economic and political trend were to continue uninterrupted in Britain, the means of production and exchange would all end up in the hands of the state, and the state in the hands of an all-powerful bureaucracy. Beginning in a different way, with different origins, along different roads, at a different pace, but in response to the same basic social causes, Britain would then develop toward the type of totalitarian collectivism which is the distinguishing mark of Stalinist society. Mr. Attlee's denunciation of Russia as a, quote, bureaucratic collectivist state, end quote, to the contrary notwithstanding. Fortunately, we are a long way from that yet, a long, long way, distinguishing periods of development and judging the pace at which changes take place, taking into account conflicting social forces and judging those conflicting social forces' interplay. These are of the essence of socialist politics. If we speak above the present trend, it is only conditional, only as abstracted from other trends and forces, and in order to indicate that this particular trend is so that knowing and understanding it, it is easier to resist it. It would be preposterous and worse, suicidal, to take the beginning for the end, the thread for the strand. It is necessary to mention more than this one fact. Stalinism not only took years to come fully to power, but Stalinism was able to reach power only because the working class movement in Russia was so deeply crushed, demoralized, passive, exhausted, whereas the British working class movement is only beginning to feel the British working class movement's power, is strong and vigorous, is inspired with socialist hopes and convictions, is impatient with the British working class's government because the British working class does not move, the British working class's government does not move fast and firmly enough toward working class socialism, and above all is still in a position to debate its problems freely, to express itself openly, to make changes and even basic changes without having to fight a ubiquitous and omnipotent police state. What is or should be overwhelmingly important for the socialist movement, for the serious British socialist in particular, is that there is a workers' government in power in Britain which is so constructed and which is based on such a popular proletarian movement as makes it possible by entirely democratic means to transform the government into a genuinely socialist workers' regime. If this were accomplished, the consequences would be breathtaking. The great wheels of history, which have sunk so deeply into the mud of retrogression for a quarter of a century, would be lifted onto a smooth, dry road and face forward at a tremendous speed. The transformation is possible. The opportunity is golden. New International, 1951.